Press the mask down. Feel the toxic mineral paste crack along your jawline, hardening over something the world was never supposed to see. History remembers Elizabeth I as the Virgin Queen, a symbol of purity and iron will. But what if the virginity wasn't a choice? What if the secret sealed beneath that porcelain facade was biological, chromosomal, and powerful enough to bring an entire empire to its knees? What if the most powerful woman in English history was never biologically female? Not as a metaphor, not as a political statement, as a chromosomal, medical, biological reality that she carried in silence for every single day of her 69 years on this earth. The theory has been circulating in forensic and endocrinological circles for decades, and it centers on a condition called androgen insensitivity syndrome. This is not a fringe conspiracy. This is a documented chromosomal anomaly in which a person is born with XY chromosomes, genetically male, but whose body is completely unable to respond to androgens, the hormones responsible for developing male physical characteristics. The result is a body that develops externally as female, feminine in shape, feminine in appearance, feminine in every way the naked eye can detect. But internally, the architecture is entirely different. No uterus, no ovaries. Instead, undescended testes tucked invisibly inside the abdominal cavity, producing estrogen in quantities high enough to create curves, soft skin, and a convincingly feminine silhouette, while producing absolutely zero capacity for pregnancy. Now place that body on the throne of England in 1558. You are Elizabeth I. You have inherited a kingdom that measures your value in one currency alone, your womb. Every ambassador who walks through your door, every foreign king who sends a marriage proposal, every member of your own privy council is watching your body for signs of fertility. They are counting the years, they are whispering, and you know, with a biological certainty that no prayer can change, that your body will never give them what they want. There will be no heir, there will be no pregnancy, there will be no menstrual cycle to confirm what every Tudor court expected a woman of childbearing age to have. The absence of that cycle alone in a court where ladies-in-waiting slept feet from your bed and handmaids prepared your linens every morning was an explosive secret. Androgen insensitivity syndrome in its complete form produces exactly the profile that historians have documented in Elizabeth I for centuries. Tall for a woman of her era, nearly 5 feet 7 inches. Unusually long fingers and limbs. A voice that foreign dignitaries described more than once as startlingly deep. A skeletal frame that her own physicians noted as broader than expected. And most critically, no confirmed menstruation ever recorded in the medical literature of the Tudor court, despite 44 years of reign and decades of marriage negotiations that hinged entirely on her reproductive capability. Her suitors waited, her counsel pleaded, and Elizabeth stalled, deflected, and performed, because the alternative was unthinkable. The Virgin Queen narrative was not born from piety. It was not born from heartbreak over Thomas Seymour or political calculation about sovereignty. It was born from biological necessity. If the court ever confirmed what her body already knew, that there was no cycle, no womb, no possibility of an heir, the theological and political consequences would have been catastrophic. In Tudor England, a monarch's divine right was inseparable from their bodily legitimacy. A queen who could not bear children was a queen whose reign had no future. A queen whose chromosomes told an entirely different story than her crown. That was not just a political liability. That was grounds for erasure. And so the mask went on, literally and figuratively. But how deep did the concealment go? And what physical evidence was Elizabeth desperately trying to hide beneath those layers of silk, powder, and performance? That is where this story gets forensically disturbing. Look at every surviving portrait of Elizabeth I, every single one. Notice what never changes. The blinding white face, the towering red wig, the rigid ruff collar climbing her neck like an architectural structure designed not for fashion but for concealment. Tudor historians have spent centuries calling this vanity. It was not vanity. It was a forensic cover operation executed in plain sight. Complete androgen insensitivity syndrome carries specific physical markers. Markers that Elizabeth's wardrobe systematically erased. The condition frequently produces sparse body hair and, critically, scalp hair loss. A pattern of baldness that mirrors what we typically associate with male hormonal profiles. By her 30s, historical accounts confirm that Elizabeth's natural hair had thinned so dramatically that wigs became non-negotiable. Not fashionable. Non-negotiable. The red wig was not an aesthetic choice. It was infrastructure. Then there is the collar. The Elizabethan ruff, that extravagant wheel of starched lace that defined an entire era of fashion, sits precisely at the base of the throat, exactly where a prominent laryngeal structure would be visible on a body with XY chromosomes. The ruff covered it completely from every angle in every portrait, at every public appearance for decades. An entire fashion movement, adopted by an entire court, that happened to perfectly conceal the one anatomical detail that could have ended a dynasty. And then came the skin. By her mid-40s, Elizabeth's face had become a ritual of chemical warfare applied to her own body every single morning. The toxic mineral paste, a corrosive heavy metal compound mixed with egg white and poppy seeds, was packed onto her skin in layers thick enough to create a rigid, mask-like surface. This was Venetian ceruse, and it was slowly destroying her. The corrosive pigment penetrated the skin, causing necrotic skin damage at the cellular level, eating through the epidermis with prolonged use. Portraits from her later years show a face that has stopped looking like skin entirely. It looks like porcelain, like plaster, like a surface that has been manufactured rather than lived in. But here's what most historians frame as mere vanity, and what forensic analysis reframes as desperation. She could not stop. Even as the heavy metallic compound visibly corroded her face, even as her real skin beneath became raw and damaged, she applied more. Because underneath that corrosive pigment was a complexion that had begun showing the specific discoloration and coarsening that AIS patients can develop with age. The mask was not cosmetic maintenance. It was biological suppression made visible. She was painting over evidence every single morning of her life. But a mask only works if no one is allowed to look beneath it. And Elizabeth's greatest threat was never a foreign army. It was the physicians, the handmaids, and the council members who kept trying to get close enough to see what the mask was hiding. 44 years. That is how long Elizabeth I ruled England without ever allowing a physician to conduct a full physical examination of her body. Stop and understand what that actually means. You are the most powerful monarch in Europe. Every cough, every fever, every moment of visible weakness sends shockwaves through your court and your enemy's courts simultaneously. Physicians are not optional for a Tudor monarch. They are political instruments, their reports read by ambassadors and counselors as intelligence documents. And yet you refuse. Every single time, for 4 decades. That is not privacy. That is a controlled operation. The crisis point came in 1566. Elizabeth collapsed into a fever so severe that her council genuinely began drafting succession contingencies. The court went into quiet panic. Her physicians pressed, urgently, politically, desperately, for a full examination. The succession of an entire empire depended on understanding what was happening inside her body. And Elizabeth, burning with fever, barely able to stand, still refused. She managed her own treatment, controlled who entered her bedchamber, and dictated the terms of her own medical care from a position of physical collapse. The willpower required to maintain that level of concealment while genuinely ill is not the behavior of a woman protecting her modesty. It is the behavior of someone who knows that a single examination reveals everything. Think about what you are managing in that moment. You are feverish, and every instinct in your court is pushing physicians toward your body. Your ladies-in-waiting are the first line of defense. Women who sleep in your chambers, who prepare your linens, who dress and undress you and have for years seen the absence of what they would expect to see every month. These women knew. They had to know. And Elizabeth managed them with a combination of fierce loyalty, generous reward, and the unspoken understanding that their silence was the price of their position. That silence was not accidental. It was purchased, maintained, and ruthlessly enforced. The Privy Council was a different battlefield. They did not need to examine her body directly. They were running actuarial calculations on her fertility window with every passing year. Each marriage negotiation Elizabeth opened and then dismantled was a masterclass in biological misdirection. She would entertain a suitor for months, sometimes years, generating enough romantic theater to convince the court she was genuinely considering marriage, before engineering a collapse of negotiations on political grounds. The council saw political calculation. What they were actually watching was a woman buying time. Because marriage meant a wedding night, and a wedding night meant a husband who would immediately understand what her chromosomes had always made inevitable. She turned biological limitation into political philosophy. The Virgin Queen narrative gave her something extraordinary. It reframed her infertility as divine election. She was not a woman who could not bear children. She was a monarch who had chosen to marry England itself. It was perhaps the most sophisticated act of biological rebranding in the history of monarchy. A chromosomal anomaly transformed into a symbol of sacred power. But the body keeps its own records. And when Elizabeth I finally died in March of 1603, the truth she had spent a lifetime sealing away came within inches of being exposed. And the people closest to her moved with terrifying speed to make sure it never was. She died on the floor, not in her bed, not with the dignified composure of a monarch meeting death on her own terms. Elizabeth I spent her final days refusing to lie down, sitting propped on cushions on the floor of her chamber at Richmond Palace, conscious and silent for days. Her council begged her to move to her bed. She refused. Some historians read this as the defiance of a stubborn queen. Forensic analysis suggests something more specific. A body in the final stages of systemic collapse, likely from the decades of corrosive heavy metal absorption from that toxic mineral paste she had applied to her skin every morning for 30 years. The necrotic skin damage had been accumulating internally as well as externally. She was, in a very literal sense, being killed by her own mask. When she finally lost consciousness and was moved to her bed, the women who prepared her body for death saw what 44 years of Tudor court theater had been constructed to hide. We do not have their testimony, we never will. What we have is the behavior of the people in that room immediately afterward. And that behavior is forensically loud. The order came fast. Her body was to be sealed. Not wrapped, not prepared with the extended ceremonial process that Tudor royal deaths typically involved, sealed. The coffin was constructed from dense, heavily soldered metal, encasing her remains in a way that was, by the standards of 1603, extraordinarily unusual for a monarch. The soldering was not ceremonial, it was conclusive. It was the final layer of a mask that had been applied in layers for 6 decades. The last coat of corrosive pigment, this time in metal rather than mineral paste, applied not to her face, but to her coffin. Westminster Abbey holds the remains of Elizabeth I in a tomb she shares with her half-sister Mary I, a detail that carries its own bitter irony. 2 half-siblings whose rivalry defined an era, sharing space in death. Modern DNA analysis techniques could theoretically answer the chromosomal question within weeks. A tissue sample, a bone fragment, the kind of forensic analysis that has rewritten historical narratives for figures far older than a 16th century English monarch. The British monarchy has been formally petitioned, more than once, by forensic historians and medical researchers requesting access to the remains for chromosomal testing. The answer has been consistently and without detailed explanation, no, Saul. Think about what that refusal means in 2025, in an era where the monarchy has allowed genetic and archaeological analysis of remains far more ancient and far more politically sensitive than Elizabeth I. The Plantagenet remains of Richard III were excavated from a Leicester parking lot, subjected to full DNA analysis, and reburied with national ceremony. That analysis was celebrated. It was framed as historical justice. But Elizabeth, whose tomb is intact, whose remains are far more accessible, whose chromosomal profile would answer one of the most persistent medical mysteries in royal history, remains untouched. The refusal is not logistical, it is political. And political refusals in forensic terms are themselves a form of evidence. The legend of the Virgin Queen is the longest-running biological performance in the history of Western monarchy. Every layer of it, the wig, the ruff, the toxic mineral paste, the refused examinations, the managed ladies-in-waiting, the dissolved marriage negotiations, the sealed coffin, the closed vault, every single layer points in the same direction. A chromosomal anomaly that sat on the English throne for 44 years, rewrote the rules of royal power, and built an empire-defining mythology out of the biological necessity to remain unknown. In the end, Elizabeth I's biology was the only secret the throne could not legislate away. She ruled as a king, performed as a queen, and her true nature remains sealed beneath layers of time, metal, and institutional silence. If this kind of forensic history, the kind that pulls back the official portrait and shows you what was underneath the paint, is what you come here for, then do 3 things right now. Subscribe to this channel because the stories we cover here are the ones mainstream history actively avoids. Leave a comment below telling us whether you believe the British monarchy should open Elizabeth's tomb for DNA testing. Because that conversation needs to happen publicly and your voice is part of it. And hit the like button because the algorithm buries this kind of content. and the only way it reaches the people who need to hear it is if you push it forward.